Good evening, everyone. For those I've not had a chance to meet, my name is John Hybush, and I have the honor of being the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize some special guests we have with us this evening. I hope maybe a few of these might still be stuck in traffic, but maybe not. If each of you would please stand and be recognized when I call your name, it would be greatly appreciated. We have a number of consul generals with us from all over the world. The consul general from Azerbaijan, Afghanistan, Armenia, Bangladesh, Bulgaria, Ecuador, France, Georgia, Hungary, Kenya, Malaysia, Poland, and the Philippines. Thank you all so much for coming. I'd also like to welcome our Ventura County Supervisor, Peter Foy. Peter, are you here? Oh, good. Thank you, Peter. And our Ventura County Sheriff, Jeff Dean. Jeff? Finally, I'd like to extend a special thanks to the Honorable Frank Greinke and SC Fuels for making our reception later this evening possible. Frank, are you? There you are. Thank you, Frank. Thanks, Frank. Well, tonight is a special night for the Reagan Library. We have received visits here before from foreign dignitaries and heads of state, and it's always an honor to welcome them. This one is particularly important. It's an important occasion because we have with us a leader in the mold of Ronald Reagan. Someone who, like our 40th president, has dedicated much of his life to the cause of freedom and democracy in a region of the world where such treasure is not won easily. We also have with us in that same leader a man who, within the shadow of the former Soviet Union, recently honored President Reagan. During 2011, the centennial year of President Reagan's birth, he erected a statue of President Reagan in his capital city of Tbilisi as a reminder of the importance of preserving freedom for future generations both in his own country and around the world. Mr. President, on behalf of Mrs. Reagan and our Board of Trustees, thank you for the honor you have bestowed upon President Reagan, and thank you for your lifelong courage in the defense of freedom. Now, we have been looking forward to President Saakashvili's visit here for some time, as have many others. Chief among them who deserve credit for his visit here is a great friend of the Reagan Library, Congressman David Dreyer. Unfortunately, he was called away at the last minute for a very important mission as a U.S. observer to the first presidential election in Egypt since the 2011 revolution, an election that is literally taking place today. Many of you know David. If you have a friend, a family member, or someone you know living in a foreign country where its emerging democracy is struggling to bring its people a future of promise, freedom, and liberty, you can rest assured they have had a helping hand from David. His work as the founder and chairman of the House Democracy Partnership in Congress and as a longtime board member of the International Republican Institute in this critical mission is unmatched. So, through the miracle of modern technology, he's joining us today to provide the formal introduction of our special guest. Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman David Dreyer.
I wish I could be there to introduce President Saakashvili in person, but as I suspect John may have told you, I'm in Egypt right now to witness the latest milestone of the Reagan legacy. Today, the Egyptian people begin their first true presidential election in 7,000 years. I hope that my friend, as a fellow proponent of Reagan's vision of liberty across the globe, will forgive my absence. Building a democracy in a region that has been hostile to the will of the people is a concept with which Mikheil Saakashvili is very familiar. There's a reason that Vladimir Putin considers him to be public enemy number one. Under President Saakashvili's leadership, the Republic of Georgia was one of the first Soviet republics to make a clean break with the past. Since the Rose Revolution in 2003, Georgia has forged ahead, implementing the vibrant democracy and free markets that President Reagan envisioned 3 decades ago. The difficulty of truly realizing the goals of a democratic revolution is only highlighted by Georgia's fellow Soviet republics. Ukraine has yet to see the promise of its Orange Revolution. Kyrgyzstan shows great potential, though only after the Tulip Revolution was reprised. Actually, of all the color revolutions of the last decade, no country has done more to advance the Reagan agenda than the Republic of Georgia. This achievement is perhaps best symbolized by the presence in Tbilisi of the only statue of Ronald Reagan in the former Soviet Union. John Hybush and I had the privilege of joining President Saakashvili to dedicate this statue last November. When we arrived for the unveiling, we had just come from a similar ceremony in Warsaw with Lech Walesa. The statue commissioned in Poland depicted a very authoritative-looking Reagan, very appropriate for the man who called on Mr. Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. But the Reagan statue commissioned by Misha is unique and is perhaps my favorite. In the Georgian depiction of our 40th president, Ronald Reagan sits on a park bench near the banks of the Kura River, where anyone can sit down right next to him and have a chat. Perhaps it was this sense of the familiar that led Misha to join a tremendous project by the accomplished artist David Ashwell, who's also there with you tonight. David, whose stunning artwork is displayed in the U.S. Capitol, conceived of a project to benefit Save the Children called Yesterday's Children. He's painted dozens of portraits of prominent leaders in different fields, all based on photographs of them as children. His subjects have included George Shultz, Condi Rice, Elaine Chao, and of course, Ronald Reagan. But Misha's portrait, which is there on display tonight, stands out for showing the world that even at the age of 5, he looked unmistakably presidential. I know that our Georgian friend will receive a tremendous welcome at the Reagan Library, but I warn you, this is a man with incredibly high standards of hospitality. When I made plans to visit Georgia for the statue unveiling, President Saakashvili insisted on hosting us for Thanksgiving dinner. His trusted aide asked me what Americans do on Thanksgiving, and I explained that we mostly just eat and eat and eat. To which he replied, with Mikheil Saakashvili, every day is Thanksgiving. True to form, he hosted us with what I believe was the first meal of roast turkey, stuffing, and mashed potatoes ever served in Tbilisi. But that was only the beginning. The next day, we traveled out to his country home for the real feast of shashlik, hachipuri, and cha-cha. I'll let the president explain cha-cha to you, but just a little hint, Georgian cha-cha doesn't start out as a dance. Misha, until we meet again for our next Georgian feast, welcome to California and the Reagan Library. You were one of the first Reagan revolutionaries of the 21st century, and I can think of no one more fitting to address this crowd. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm incredibly humbled by John's and David's introduction and by this incredible settings. I feel myself as a schoolboy that was driven here to have the first taste of what was the greatest political career of not only 20th century, but I think in the history in general. And certainly, Ronald Reagan is not just another president or just another leader. I think it's something, this is the name that defines who we are. Me, my friends, many countries, including that of my own, what America is for the world, what being American is for the people who have incredible honor and privilege to live in this country. So I'm really very humbled and grateful that I was invited here today. Certainly, it is a great honor to be here and to address the Reagan Library, all of you who came for this event. For all of us who grew out there in the cold behind the Iron Curtain, that was dividing Europe, Ronald Reagan was and will always remain the initiator of our liberation, the instigator of the great dream of the Europe whole and free, a dream that remains today to be completed. He was and will always remain the president, the man who came in front of the Brandenburg Gate on June 12, 1987, and famously ordered, "Come to this gate, Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate, tear down this wall." For all of us oppressed people living in an oppressive society that was hated with all our soul, heart, and mind, Ronald Reagan was a symbol of freedom and hope. I was, at that moment when he had made this speech, a Soviet border guard. And like all of us in that times, we were summoned to enlisted to the Soviet army. And I would keep a very small radio receiver under my pillow. And it was an offense punishable by at least 2 weeks of arrest in very hard military prison. There were occasions when they were searching all the time for these kind of things. And on that small radio transmitter, I heard on BBC World Service Reagan's speech. And it was really miserable reality for me back then. I hated every second of it. But then Reagan gave me some kind of, not only just hope, but relief, some kind of stay from this. He lifted me from that place and took me somewhere else. And I would imagine it would be the same reaction for people in labor camps, gulag, and we all of us were some kind of, secluded, prisoners from some kind of secluded place. So I remember that moment pretty vividly. I was a young student in parallel at that time, and despite my adoration for him and the values he was standing for, I still could not imagine how much his principles and visions would influence my nation's fate and my personal life. I came here today to you to share with you my optimism. It can look strange coming from a leader whose country is partially occupied by a country 100 times bigger than that of his own. Is under that country that's under existential threat, the country against whom there are daily provocations, the budget that is spent against us in political campaign only this year is bigger than the national budget of the country that is spent all the other things. Sometimes it's really surreal to what extent they would go to undermine our young democracy. And it's strange to have a message from a person who was declared cadaver by Russia's president just a few years ago, and whose present leader officially proclaimed that he's after parts of my body, certain parts of my body. But here I am in the Reagan Library to share with you my optimism. My optimism about the triumph of freedom, about the American leadership in the world, about the future of NATO and the future inside NATO of my own country, Georgia. This optimism was one of the most important characteristics of Ronald Reagan as a man, as a political leader, as a president. I always recall when I have doubts in my mind about certain things, his inauguration speech on January 20th, 1981. The whole world was speaking about the American decline back then. A tsunami of pessimism had overwhelmed the West in the preceding decade. The USSR looked almighty, and the economy here looked hopeless. We would be shown on Soviet television long lines for gas in the US petrol station, and that time it wasn't fake, that was really happening, as we know. And here, in the message Ronald Reagan delivered to the world, we have every right to have heroic dreams. Those who say we are not in a time there where there are heroes, they just don't know where to look at. In a tired world, Reagan brought optimism. And I remember, by the way, the story that David Dreyer told me. Maybe some of you know that. He, as a young congressman, came together with the other congressmen who totally adored Reagan, but that was at the time the worst thing. I mean, their party has really plummeted in popularity, like in single digits they were at that moment. So they went to the place not far from here, to the Reagan Ranch for lunch. And Reagan seemed to be in very upbeat mood, and all these young people, crowds, seemed to be very depressed. So after a while, they dared to ask him, why are you in such a joyous mood, Mr. President, jovial mood? And he was like, he looked at them and said, there is this story about this really bad traffic accident in America's Midwest. And then there was this bus full of cattle and and driver of the bus. And so, there was really horrible accident. So all this, some animals, cattle that were transporting died, some were like badly wounded. So sheriff stops by and he looks at a dog and takes out his gun and takes him out of misery. Then he looks at a cow, really badly wounded cow, with blood all over it. He takes his gun and, also shoots the cow, takes it out of misery. And then he looks at the driver, who is really badly wounded, like he has blood all over his face. And he said, how are you feeling, sir? And the guy says, I've never felt better in my life. So that's a very telling story, actually. It would cheer us up, even decades after, in similar circumstances. I've almost never been in those circumstances, but certainly there is something that, it transpires for generations, these kind of stories. And then there is another big phrase by Reagan, which exactly replicates the phrase I have on the facade of our new presidential palace, which comes from Georgia's poet of 12th century, Shota Rustavelli, for his poem, which was amazing classic for world literature, The Night of the Tiger Skin. And what Reagan said, I know in my heart that man is good and that what is right will eventually triumph. The man is good and what is right will eventually triumph. It's on the facade of our palace. It comes from our own history and from our own literature. But this is what, I guess, all the great geniuses of their times believed in. There is no other way you would carry on if you don't believe in that. Well, when your country is occupied, when we are living these permanent menaces, that's kind of vision you need. Reagan optimism does not only bring comfort of fighting spirit in difficult time. It is simply true, and Georgia is a good testament to this. Ladies and gentlemen, Georgia was the most corrupt, most criminalized place of the overwhelmingly corrupt and criminalized Soviet Empire, they renamed post-Soviet space. It was a country divided by hatreds, suffocated by authoritarian vertical political and social structures, crippled by corruption and crime. 10 years ago, we were a failed state. A new generation came to power with the Rose Revolution, two Reaganian principles: downsize the government and look forward rather than backward. We in the government should look at our country with the eyes of the entrepreneur, seeing possibilities where others see problems. That's what Reagan said. That's exactly what we did. What we did is a total change of mentality. The reforms we did, downsizing of bureaucracy, scrapping the 80 or 90% of all the bureaucracy agencies, all these useless people who tried to sell their job as terribly useful. And that brought us change of mentality all over this place. And change of mentality in terms of how people view their institutions, how people view their government, how people view their responsibilities, how people approach different ethnic groups and religious groups, because that was a big thing in former communist sphere, to manipulate people through these centuries-old enmities, hostilities, strained relations between different religious, ethnic, and linguistic groups. In America, our origins matter less than our destination. That is what democracy is all about. That's also true about Georgia of today. And we are all building society that's based on meritocracy and not who you are or who your ancestors were or where you were born, whether you were born to wealth or whether you were born to modest origin. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, these principles actually do work everywhere. They work in the US, they work in Georgia as well. They would work anywhere where you have men and women. Thanks to those principles, thanks to the idealists and the optimists, Georgia has achieved a transformation that we could hardly foresee in our craziest dreams. This is not an accident. Therefore, if Ronald Reagan statue sits in the middle of the sense, in the middle of our capital, just under the presidential palace, his vision has guided us. It has led us in our generation to believe that everything is possible. Georgia has become more than a country. In our region, it is an idea. For our troubled but strategic region, the surprising survival and the shining success of Georgia's democratic experience is a message of hope for everybody around us. For a long time, people thought in the post-Soviet space that there are only two choices. One, messy so-called democracy like they had in the 90s in Russia, with certain freedom of word, even if journalists were slaughtered and killed, but still there was freedom of word, freedom of assembly, huge corruption, crime rate, declining standards of life, or the other alternative was what later Vladimir Putin brought to Russia, authoritarian rule, regulated corruption, well, he didn't annihilate it, but regulated it, putting under control criminal structures, corrupt structures, everything. It's just now under control. It's checked by the supreme authority. It cannot be corrupt on your own or criminal on your own. You have to also serve the supreme goal. And Georgia has shown that, but in fact, this regulated stuff seemed more orderly to some people who were tired of unregulated ones, so they basically bought it for some time. Georgia showed that there is a third path, the path of democratic values. Of course, this brings the highest dangers on us, because we are challenging the very basis of Russian regime and domination in the region. But we have an important ally, the United States of America. Without President Bush and President Obama's defense of our independence, I will not be here to address you today. In an address to the nation, Reagan said in 1984, history teaches that wars begin when hostile government believes the price of aggression is cheap. The alliance with the US, based on common values and shared principles, is the keystone of our foreign policy. It is more than that, more than a diplomatic choice or national security issue. It is a choice of values, choice of society, choice of life. For those who are on the front line of fights for democratic values, there cannot be such thing, there is no such thing as an American decline. From the Arab world to the post-Soviet space, from Asia to Europe, people are still looking at you, at your nation, as the pivotal force in the world for freedom and good. This is not a matter of democratic or Republican administration. This goes beyond economic downturn or moral crisis. This is the very essence of American role in the world. Americans' best days are yet to come, and our glorious achievements are just ahead, as Reagan said. Ronald Reagan had at the same time a resolute faith in the future, and absolute optimism, in the sense that history could never come to an end, that it would not always remain tragic. Let me quote him once again. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We did not pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed for them to do the same. These words resonate in Georgia more than anywhere else. We know how precious freedom is and how fragile at the same time. We know what it means to be deprived of it, and we know what it means to fight for it. Freedom is everything. It is at the same time the sun and is making things grow, and the light that allows us to see them. Nothing has value without freedom. Nothing exists, in fact, without freedom. Already in 1952, Reagan gave the true meaning of American predominance in the world. America is less of a place than an idea that has been deep in the souls of man. And certainly, this great idea that is deep in the souls of man, this is all about freedom. And that's what we are trying to protect and develop in Georgia of today. Thank you.